Fox, I got to be honest with you, man. When Hal told me about you, it was because I reached out to social media and I said, "Hey, I want to talk to someone in law enforcement, someone learned, had been through the ringer for like many years, could really speak to the issues of law enforcement." Hal was like, I think I know a guy. He's a buddy of mine. He like really undersold you. I reached out to you and I was like, hey, I just started this small podcast. I really like to talk to someone in law enforcement, ex-military, possibly, whatever it is. Like, if you don't mind, if you have time. And you proceeded to blow my mind for like the next week. So first and foremost, I want to say thank you for being on here. You're much more credentialed. For those that might not know you, you are much more credentialed and you are doing me a favor, and I acknowledge that and thank you, sir. So I
Yeah, man, my
appreciate you
pleasure
being
to be
here.
here. It's awesome to be in town, with somebody that comes from the same gym, even. So very cool.
Yeah. Mike was actually the one that talked to you about you too, because I was asking him like, we after his episode, we were kind of just talking about like what this podcast is gonna be, guests and all that, and then he was trying to gauge to me like what it was that I was trying to do, and I was trying to explain to him, I'm like, there's no curriculum to this. There's no like, I'm just trying to have conversations with people that I find either fascinating or are much more educated on a topic that I'm interested in that can teach me something. And I think I've hit the nail on the head on both of those with having you here. Um, so the reason I brought you on is during COVID, during Black Lives Matter protests, during the fallout of the George Floyd incident, it was quickly apparent to me, and the Kyle Rittenhouse incident, and all these other things that were basically tied to law enforcement and criminality, what is permissible, what is not. I thought to myself, you know, it must be so incredibly difficult to be a police officer, not just from like the training portion of it, not just the optics of being someone who protects and serves, but also like getting into the pay for the type of work. How much training do these guys actually go through? What kind of person, like physically, mentally, emotionally, makes for good law enforcement? I don't have all the answers. I went down a couple rabbit holes, but I love having someone like you to talk to educate me on this. So for those that might not know you, could you just give like a brief 2-3 minute elevator pitch of who you are? Because I think it'll shock some people how legit you are.
I'm old, so at 50, it takes a long time to talk about all the years, right? I'm not 30. So I am a Marine. I am a former SWAT guy. I am a former MMA guy. I'm a current BJJ competitor. I own a security company that does 80% entertainment, so music, tours, and films, and then 20% governmental or private executive type security. The overwhelming majority of our work is overseas. So we're at 151 or 152 countries that we're operating in right now. So I'm on the move, just like kind of scheduling this and saying like, here's the window. Like we can do it now or never. So a lot of that, the last 30 years, I started at 17 in the Marines, and I'm doing a lot of the same stuff, just more nuanced detail in it and more complex and much broader scope now. So some of these books that we have here, I've written in my spare time or time off. That doesn't happen much. Got a few sponsors that we've got out here. Um, I'm a busy dude, and I stay busy. I think I probably need to not be so busy, but I'm about producing stuff and growing constantly. I'm never satisfied. It's probably a good and a bad thing, right? It's a curse in one way, and the other is you're gonna constantly be putting out stuff. So
If you weren't so busy, when you say things like, I shouldn't be this busy, or, my drive can be a curse and a blessing, elaborate on that. What would you be doing if you weren't doing this?
So as you get older, and let's say your testosterone levels go down, you have a lot of injuries, maybe you don't sleep as well. Everything suffers for that, and all the stuff you did in your 20s and 30s comes back and bites you. So if you're able to sleep a little bit more, if you're able to relax a little bit more, lower cortisol levels, have less on your agenda, I think probably you can reduce some of the inflammation in your body in general and some of the cognitive load that occurs. So I think there's value. Like, I know you did MMA. For me, there was never any recovery time built in. It was work a 12-hour day, do a 2 to 3 hour training session, and then repeat again. So knowing what I know now as an older guy, what I'm referencing is recovery. right? Recovery can be physical, it can be mental, it can be spiritual, whatever aspect it is. That's kind of what I'm bad at. That's the thing that I'm not doing. I'm a high producer. I'm a super driven person, but I need to probably start with this age, slowing it down a little bit so that I can recover and continue to produce, right? Because if I don't recover, then I'll probably have a sharp decline at some point as opposed to a slower decline.
I think it's also a skill set that's kind of forced on you, because I remember when I was younger, to your point about MMA, when I was like 21, 22, 23, I mean, I could train all day, go to school, work, sleep 3-4 hours, wake up the next day, and I'm good for another 3-4 hour session. Now, if I have like a 2-3 hour training session, I'm feeling it into lunch the next day.
Yeah, so there's a couple things you said. One is action consequence model. So when you're young, you do a lot of things that don't have an immediate consequence. They have a consequence, but it's 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road, right? You have injuries that you're like, okay, I'm good 2 weeks later. And then 20 years, like it comes back and it's screaming at you and you pay for it every day the rest of your life. And then, when you talk about recovery, like when I was your age was my perfect prime. And even actually a little bit, probably 5 years older than you, I think was my real prime, because your body might be like 32 to 36 and your mind might be in your 50s. So like time wise, to line up your body and your mind in terms of meeting that kind of perfect union, I think is mid 30s, late 30s. Like that's where you're smart, because you're kind of stupid in your 20s, right? Your brain develops until you're 25 years old. So you have that. And then we're overloaded with testosterone, like especially guys that fight and do military stuff and all of this. And you're moving and you're not thinking as much. And then as you get older, because the consequences there, whether you have a family or you have a mortgage or whatever it may be, now with that in mind, things start to shift, they start to change. And I think that's kind of something that you will see. Your mind will shift even more than it has now. You're probably very different now than you were 15 years ago. And in another 15 years, you're going to have that balance shift or tip a little bit. Now, I'm still doing all the stuff I love to do. I have a competition this weekend. I was at SC MMA training this morning. So I'm not out of the game, but I'm also in touch with reality. It's, 50 is not 30, 50 is not 20. So I have to adjust. I have to sleep different. I have to eat different. I have to move different. I have to wear padding that I didn't have to wear before. I have to cut out moves that are high risk. I have to even look at maybe who I'm training with and say, I'm not going with that guy. He's 220. I'm 175. I get nothing out of it. And I'm not going with that guy because he's a spaz. He has no technique. And, even 5 years ago, I wouldn't turn anybody down for role ever, no matter how big, no matter how good, no matter how much time off I had. My mind has adjusted because I realized that I keep getting hurt with these same guys.
Do you think it was the ego that was kind of just stepping
Absolutely.
away?
Absolutely. My ego is my enemy, but also my ego keeps me going. So it works both ways, like the things that we're talking about now, right? You're trying to find a pace or a balance, and balance doesn't really exist in this kind of stuff that I'm doing, but you try to go in that general direction. How do I level things out a bit as you get older, right? Your body, your mind, your spirituality, whatever it is, whether it's a religion or something else. And that's the big lesson for me of being this age and still doing all the things. I'm doing young man stuff, right? All the stuff I'm doing, traveling around the world nonstop, competing nonstop, developing new stuff, writing stuff as I'm in the middle of doing the others. That's young guy stuff.
No, I think you don't give yourself enough credit when you say things like that, because I met you for the first time physically today, and I got to be honest with you. You've aged like fine wine, and I think that's probably a product of your lifestyle.
Is that going to cost me later to have to pay you? Are you guys going to?
No. I mean, dude, I hope when I'm 50, I look that good.
I thought the same thing.
Right?
It's too nice. I'm gonna be paying these guys later for saying nice things.
No, but I also know people. So you've had a lifetime of rigorous physical activity, rigorous trauma on the body, but yet here you are at 50, and from at least the outside perspective, I can see you walk fine, you talk fine. There's no like mental acuity issues. There's no physical problems where you're walking with a limp or anything. These things.
Yeah,
I know
thankfully.
people that are half your age with some of these problems. So let me ask you this: in your lifetime, have you always been cognizant of like the therapeutic of recovery and not understanding that you're running the engine red and like you have to take care of your body, because that's a skill set I don't see in a lot of people my age.
Yeah. So if you look at Rodrigo's first school, it was in West County. And West County, for people that don't know, is a more affluent community of St. Louis, right? The vast majority of people came from North County, South County, Jeffco, Franklin County. Nobody's from that area except me and one other guy. And you could see, like, they just went hard 100% of the time and they didn't care about consequences. And having been educated, undergrad and graduate school and stuff, you had a little bit more information to work with than the average person did back at the gym at that time. And we went hard, but you could see the toll that it was taking on people. So you start to adjust. But the flip side of that too is that keeping up this pace keeps me in shape. And for example, Kirk and I were talking about this today. I don't care for jiu-jitsu rule sets like IBJJF, but I do it. And I do it because if I can operate in that really tight rule set, I can operate in most rule sets that I'm doing. And it's people that I don't know that I'm going against. And guess what? I have to make weight. So I need to hover in a very specific weight class. I can't at 50 drop 20 pounds in a day anymore. Those days are gone, right? A couple pounds, 2-3 pounds, no big deal. So that kind of keeps you in these parameters. And the guys that are my age that don't do this stuff, they're on the couch, they're watching TV. I don't watch TV. If you talk to me about any TV shows or even films anymore, like I wouldn't know. So there is a pro to the constant movement. You know, they say rust doesn't grow on moving parts, and to some degree, I think that's true. Like all the injuries I have get worse when I sit out. If I move even a little bit every day, all of the injuries are better. All of them.
Makes you think of the if you don't use it, you lose it kind of motto. I would agree with that. I noticed that whenever I take long periods of time away from training, maybe for work, what have you, whenever I come back, that I wouldn't say a learning curve, but that blow to the body, I always make the comment of like my body got soft. Like it's my joints, my muscles, the tendons. I'm like I'm not used to rigorous activity, and I don't want to say it aged me, but it makes it harder to get back in. I think that's a vicious cycle a lot of people get in. It's like, I don't feel good when I go work out because I never work out, so I don't want to work out. Yes. And that is just like a vicious cycle of never going and bettering yourself physically, mentally, emotionally, what have you. Yes. Because I look at training now, when I was younger, and I'm sure we might resonate on some of this. Like I used to compete, or I used to train with the motto of like, I want to be the best in the world, the best combative in the world, right? And then when I got a little older and I realized that it's not going to be possible, I thought to myself, well, I want to train now for me. I want to train for my skill set. I want to train for my mentality because it's therapeutic. I love going to the gym. I love getting a good sweat. I love like testing myself against other people, their skill sets, the camaraderie you build, I don't want to say I will say the brotherhood. I mean, some of my best friends are the people that I compete with and punch me in the face and tap me out regularly, So it's, I probably say this every podcast, but I would strongly recommend any man, any woman to go to a martial art of your choice, whether it's boxing, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, whatever it is. And I would strongly recommend anybody do a martial art. It's just so net positive to your life. I can't say it enough. You have an extensive military background, combative background, but you also said that you went and got your undergrad and graduate degree. So in what order did you do that? Did you enlist first or did you go to school first?
No, I went straight out of high school. So I joined the Marine Corps at 17. And then when I ended up back in St. Louis on recruiting duty, I was going to night school. And I was training too. The actual first Team Boggy Jiu-Jitsu gym was next to the recruiting office. So I was teaching karate at night at a place called Tracy's Karate, which is Kempo Karate. And we had a separate class, which was more like Kyokushinkai, like bare knuckle karate. And Rodrigo opened up literally right next door to my office. And that's how I met him. And that's how I started training. And then at the time, NHB was brand new, no holds barred. And it started going from there. But I was in school that whole time. So I went to undergrad at a local school that is based in Columbia, and then I went to graduate school here in town. I went to the military base. There's Scott Air Force Base is where I ended up going, but one went to Webster.
Nice. Military background, educated man, lived a life that I would assume could lead to an autobiography and all these other things. You chose to be an author yourself. Walk me through the thought process of, first of all, writing books about, I'm guessing, a field you're very educated and passionate in. I don't even know the first thing about beginning to write a book, like the publishing aspect, all these various things. So like, can you walk me through when you thought about writing a book, what the logistics of that looked like, and finally the end product? Because now you've written how many? 5? You're a multiple author, multiple time author. So I mean,
Yeah.
this is clearly something that you enjoy.
Yeah, so you hit it on the head. One is you have to have a passion. And in my case, my books aren't about me, and they're not even about, really something outside of it. It's really almost like technical manuals, right? They're how to do something specifically. So the first book that I wrote, I initially wrote it in 2007. And the reason that I wrote it was because I went into celebrity protection and doing music touring, so tour security. And I had a high threat protective operations background. And there's nothing alike. They're as alike as jujitsu and Muay Thai, right? They fit together, but they're very different things with very different rule sets. And so when I went into the field, I said, what are the books that I can read? What are the videos I can look at? Who are the people that nothing. So the first thing I did was started to collect the information that I thought was pertinent, like my learning curve over like a 10-year period. What have I learned? How did it fit together? How can I structure it? Because it hadn't been done before, so there was no template for me to do this. I took the things that I thought were pertinent, condensed it down to like 120 pages, and then put it in an order that I thought was logical. And then that one was self-published, and then the other ones kind of followed a similar suit. So
Forgive me, when you say self-published, what does that mean?
yeah, so you have a few different ways to do this, and I have several different books that have been done different ways. But self-published would be like you come up with a book, you write it, and then there's a company that will print the book, that will promote the book, but you will pay for it as it goes. So you are the only partner in the process, meaning everything is a paid or hired gun. So you pay that company, they put it out. It could be in e-format, it could be in paperback, it could be whatever. And then you reap the benefits, and then they'll take a percentage, or you're a flat fee. And then you pay that flat fee, they do the thing, and you take 100%. Obviously, there are costs like the cost of the actual book being done, the cost of shipping, whatever else, stuff like that. So that would be more of, by yourself, independent. You produce this book, self-published through whatever medium. Now I think in 2024, there's got to be dozens of companies that do it. Back in the day, there used to be 2 or 3. Now I'm sure there's a bunch more, but they'll take it. So then you have another one, which is when you go and get a publishing deal with somebody. And it can be small, it can be a tiny group, or it can be a really big house. The kind of stuff that I'm doing is never going to be really big because it's not made for the masses. It's made
It's
for
niche.
Yeah, it's a niche market. It's a small group of people, and again, it's technical manual almost in style. So that is not a thing. It would be small house. They publish it for you. They take a percentage of everything on the front end, and then you get back end. And then there's a blend. So like I have a group of guys who like what I do, and they fund all of the cost involved, and then we make a deal and they get a percentage of that.
Gotcha.
So there's a bunch of different structures that you can utilize to do it. Probably, if I'm being honest, now in this day and age, you can just go straight to ebook and go to Amazon and go to Apple and Barnes and Noble, and they have different formats. So with each device comes a different format, and like a literal different format. So
It's different software. Makes sense.
yeah, so you have to get the book translated into that. And so the book then, the way that you flip pages. So you can have this general formatting, you can have this what was called fixed formatting. So if you have a picture type book, you don't want like a picture to be on one page and a text to be on another page. Like if that text is about that picture, you don't want them flipping.
Yeah.
So how that gets formatted is very specific, but you can go now to any of these groups and make a deal direct, like with Kindle Publishing, and all that stuff gets done. I don't use that format, but it's very easy to do.
How has writing the books, like, whether you were doing research or whether you were thinking internally to your own experiences, because I often say, at least in martial arts, the best students are the teachers because they never stop learning. And once you start teaching something, you start realizing like, oh, this series, let's say an arm bar, it actually comprises of like 3 or 4 different positions. And if you don't give enough attention or enough nuance to each one of these positions, then the whole entire position will be compromised. So when you're writing these books, or when you're formulating the concept, or something that you think isn't out there currently that you can kind of feel the value of, how much more does that kind of engross you in your line of work? Because now you're hyper analyzing yourself to write these books.
Yeah, I mean, the oddly enough, the books are not about me. So when I look at this and I'm analyzing it, I don't beat it up too much. I say, what would the average person coming into this field need to know? Not only what didn't I know, what did I learn along the way that was really critical? And so every one of the books that I've done has been through that lens of like, what do people need to know if they want to follow this path? And, I will sometimes run into roadblocks, and, I think it's this way, but I got to walk on eggshells about how I present that. And then I'll go to one of my mentors and say, hey, I've run into this issue. This is what I think. And can you think of a way that I could deliver this so that it could be absorbed by somebody, but also, I didn't get my book banned because I said X, Y, Z. So I will divert to those people occasionally, but most of it is stuff that I've learned along the way that if I had known on the front end, I could have saved myself months, years, tens of thousands of dollars. So what would I want if I'm starting out in whatever field it is? Let's say I'm a jiu-jitsu guy. Underpinning, the current release, is basically aimed at BJJ guys, MMA guys, teaching cops. And they know nothing about being a cop. They know nothing about the laws. They know nothing about agency policies. They know nothing about the gear they're wearing. They know nothing about the environments they're fighting in. They know nothing about the current topics in those realms. So what would I need to know if I wanted to teach cops? And that's what that book is about. And so it gives them a step-by-step understanding of all of the different nuanced details, ideas, concepts. It gives them even like things that are reoccurring themes within that subject matter, and then how to deliver that training specific to those guys in a way that allows the agency to format it, send it to a group like POST, like the Peace Officer Standards and Training, even specific to policy, like how they can write it into policy, how they correlate their training to existing statutes or federal laws or case law, like Graham versus Connor, things like that. So my books are always aimed at the end user, and it's not just my experience, it's my experience coupled with what I see other people struggling with, right? And one of the things you just said was talking about kind of like when you start out and you don't know something, you learn these details, it forces you to understand it better. So, I'm not a particularly great athlete. I'm not particularly smart. And when I learn these things, I have to learn it from the bottom up. So now when I go to teach it, I understand it in its full capacity, in its totality. And that helps me to break it down into small, digestible pieces to deliver. And now I've had so many years of experience that I see like where you're at when I watch you. I see where he's at. I see where she's at. And I know that I can't teach the same way to every guy. And we talked a little bit about this before, but you have visual learners, you have auditory learners, you have kinesthetic, and most people are blended in some sort of way. Then I start to see your style and how you move. Let's say you've got long limbs and this other guy's got short limbs, and this person has thick limbs and that person has thin limbs. This person's athletic, this person's not athletic. This person's very aggressive, this person's very passive. That changes what they can do and how they can do it. And so if I'm an instructor of any of the things I'm teaching, I have to first understand my environment and then understand all of the pieces of what I'm about to teach, and then understand what and how to deliver to these specific parties that are in the room with me. So it's not me going and replicating a BJJ class that's done in a Brazilian style, which is like, oh, today we're doing XYZ, and tomorrow we're doing, and there's no connection. So it's a very different thing. And so that particular book was super analytical. And if people read it, if they're really curious about the subject or they're going to teach police, it's going to put them on par with the average defensive tactics instructor at a law enforcement agency. Maybe it'll put them ahead of them, to be quite frank.
I like that. In your description of the book, you actually said something that I never even thought about. The reason I brought you on was to talk about how I at least view law enforcement to be an impossible job, but I never thought about training law enforcement can also be like an equally difficult, if not more so, because when I coach MMA, it was different than when I did MMA, because then I felt like I owed these people to teach them properly because they're going to get into a cage. And if I don't teach them the skill set that they're going to need to at the very least defend themselves, I'm going to get them hurt. I could only assume that the instructors for these police officers feel that same duty, but to the utmost degree, because we're not talking about, getting knocked out and then the ref breaks up the fight.
Yes.
We're talking about an altercation that could possibly lead to the end of this person's life.
Yes, or the others. So there is or should be a responsibility. If there's not a responsibility that's felt by that person teaching, they're not the right person for the job to begin with. But when you talk about MMA, like MMA is very close in nature to a lot of the DT aspects. But when you start to think about this stuff, there are so many complexities. When we talk about, let's say just analyzing and compare and contrast with boxing and Muay Thai, how many weapons are there in boxing?
I would say 2 each hand.
Okay, so there's 2 weapons. How much of the body can you strike?
Half of it. Waist
Okay,
up.
so now we look at 2 weapons and half the body. So 2 weapons, half the body is the target. What about Muay Thai?
I would say double that, because now actually the art of 8, you can X that by 4, right? So
Yes,
it's like 2 times
quadruple.
4 would be 8.
And how much of the body?
The whole thing.
Okay, so now we go from 2 to 8, and now we go from half to the full body. It's far more complex. Now, what about adding in jiu-jitsu? Now when we start to talk about takedowns, and we start to talk about throws, and we start to talk about clinch, and we start to talk about now getting to the ground and doing all of the different things there, whether you're talking about sweeping or submitting or controlling, and then you start to talk about adding those strikes in on the ground. So now we're talking about this. Now, talk about adding in some gear, right? Now I've got 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds of gear. I've got a body camera, right, that's recording everything that I'm doing, and it's only getting one angle. So there's a bunch of angles that are possible. It only captures one, and it's a moment in time. And now it's for my life. It's not for points. It's not for a medal. It's not for money. It's for my life. And I've only had, let's say, 40, 50, 60 hours of training. Whereas in MMA, let's say you train 2-3 hours a day, 6 days a week for 6 months or a year, whatever you do. The consequence is far greater, not just in terms of, like, I could die. I could also inadvertently kill that person. If I didn't mean to, that's a big problem. It's a problem for me. It's a problem for them. It's a problem for the community. It's a problem for the agency. It's a problem for the local government. So it's far more complex. And then when we start talking about that gear, the jiu-jitsu that we do with a gi on, IBJJF, or the MMA that we do, or even like Abu Dhabi style no gi, it doesn't take into consideration any of that stuff, right? None, zero, right? When you start to talk about weapons, right? You start talking about, like, on a duty belt for a law enforcement officer, you've got a gun, you've got spare magazines, you've got cuffs, you've got OC spray, you've got a taser, some people have a bolo, you've got all these things around their waistline, right? So it's not just weighing them down, but now there's 2 components. I have to cycle through what's on my waistline and choose the right thing. You don't have that in any of the sports that we're talking about. So now we're starting to get into this process known as Hick's Law. When I have all of these choices and I have to cycle through the options, I'm slower to make a decision, and I'm less likely to select the correct one for that particular condition because I'm overwhelmed by the options. So the idea publicly that putting more tools on their belt gives them more options and it's a better thing, I don't agree with at all. In fact, scientifically, Hick's Law disproves that concept. So I wrote about that in the book, right? When you think about cycling through these ideas, right, the most common thing to talk about would be something like OODA loop. So you observe something, you orient to it, you decide what you're going to do, and then you act. And so if I can beat you through that mental cycle, I will typically win that fight. So it came from a fighter pilot in the Air Force named Colonel Boyd. And so he figured that as these guys are in a dogfight in the air, whoever can cycle through that process typically wins that battle in the air. Same applies in jiu-jitsu, boxing, MMA, Muay Thai, any type of confrontation. So all of these processes and systems, think about this when you talk about MMA and teaching and learning. When you have this bell-shaped curve for how much stress you have to your level of performance, if you have no stress, what they call arousal, your performance typically will be pretty low. But when you start to get stressed and you have to deal with something, you have an adrenaline dump and you take something seriously, now your performance goes up. But then when the situation is too stressful, it's more than you've trained for, it's more than you can handle, now your performance starts to go back down. So finding that type of curve and training them to this level that they're going to face is very, very different than in MMA or Muay Thai or Jiu-Jitsu or boxing. Those are great things. They do correlate, but how they're taught needs to be adjusted. And if they're not adjusted, then you take this Leo who now has to take what he learned from a classic BJJ guy, and he has to reformulate it to see it through the lens of a Leo.
What is a Leo? Forgive me.
A Leo is a law enforcement officer. So
Forgive me,
if
okay.
you think about me saying police, the FBI are not police. They're law enforcement officers. So agents and any type of person operating under the authority of law who has the ability to make an arrest is a law enforcement officer. So a Leo is the short term for that. So it's very different, and you have to put those things into context. The thing is, the guys are running around saying, there's no difference. This is the way to do it. This is the best way. The Gracies did it this way. Whatever they're saying is because they don't know any better. And even within our own kind of circles, I get that from guys all the time because it's from a place of ignorance, right? They don't understand all the variables. They don't understand the constitutional law related to use of force. They don't understand the cases that surround it. They don't understand the state statute, in particular here in Missouri. They don't understand the agency they're working for, their policy on use of force. They don't understand how positions change, like things that are great for us in jiu-jitsu, like an underhook, how that can hurt us in other spots in gear. They never are fighting. And let me just grab this while we're talking. So this guy is a great example, right? So when I hand this to you, just keep your arms straight out.
Yeah.
Here, your arms start to drop down.
And you were telling me that this isn't even the full gear.
No, this is not the full gear. So you
like-
see right here, it's got 3 mags on it. It's missing 2 right here. There's no rifle. There's no CS, gas. There's a ton of stuff missing on this. But when you put this on, the fight changes. It also gives grips that don't exist in other places, right? So it's problematic. So this changes things, right? We can set this down, but you don't know what you don't know.
Well,
right?
I always thought it was, and I don't know what the alternative to this would be, but I always thought it was kind of, I want to be careful the verbiage I use. I don't want to say dumb because I don't know what else they could use, right? But like to have all of these weapons on the waist of a police officer or a law enforcement officer, they can easily, like if I overwhelm you physically, those weapons that were used or should be used to protect a law enforcement officer can now be used to harm them. I mean, if I can overwhelm you physically,
it happens.
Now I have a gun at my disposal. Now I have your baton. Now I have your mace or whatever it is.
It's called a human holster. You're just holding the gun for me until I get it from you.
Exactly.
So that happens, and it happens, unfortunately, with some frequency. So it's based on the level of training. So we have to back up. This is a 2-hour-long, 3-hour-long discussion. But if we want to hit the high points, we start on the front end, and the front end is hiring. So when you have an agency hiring, really who's going to fund it is the city, right? So, the city council will be involved in that, but the chief of police is normally the guy that's going to say, this is what we want, this is how we're going to do it. And then you have an interview board, and they're going to look for people that are qualified. So they're going to have to go through an academy. And in Missouri, it's 1,000 to 1,200 hours, depending on where you go. But before I even send somebody to an academy.
Forgive me, 1,000 to 1,200 hours?
Yes.
That's what, anywhere between
6 months.
6 months, okay.
Yeah. So
Does
when
that
you
seem like enough?
Well, we're not there yet.
Forgive me.
I'll answer it out of order, but no, it's never going to be enough. Only because they're no longer just policing. Now they're doing, like crisis intervention. Yeah. Now they're doing medical treatment.
It could be
now
a drug addict. It could be
so they're dealing with so many things. You can't be a subject matter expert on everything. So what happens is if I have this 6-month window to train you based on money, how much time can I spend training you up before all of a sudden it's not cost effective anymore? The agency can't afford to pay for 5 years of training and then you go do the job and quit. So it's condensed into 6 months. But when I say 6 months, when you think about that, if you look at most people, they get hired after college and they have no job specific training. They learn on the job, OJT training. So it's not enough because what they're getting asked to do is too broad, right? They're not just policing or enforcing laws anymore. They're doing all these other things, right? So a large percentage of the time now has to be dedicated to, cultural awareness, racial profiling, sensitivity training, all of these things. So that's eating the time where they do the higher risk things like shooting, fighting, driving, defensive tactics, general broad use of force. Those things hurt because you have to shift that time away to this. And so they're going to get weaker over here while they're developing these new skills that are more like social police as opposed to, the old school police from a different era. So where it starts is at the community level. So the community says to the police chief, we can fund this. This is what's going to happen. Then the police chief says, I want whatever. And this is a broad stroke. So this is not every police chief. Mm-hmm. But many will say, which officer will cause me the least amount of problems? A guy who can talk very good but is not very aggressive, or a guy who's aggressive when stuff happens? That guy can create lawsuits that I don't need. So most of the time, let's say it's 99% of the time, nothing's going to happen.
Forgive me, when you say lawsuits I don't need, you mean from the perspective of the police chief of that municipality or city?
Yes. So now, if you look at even agencies like Chicago, right, they're basically throwing out money. Somebody makes an accusation, they sue the department. Hey, let's just settle. We're going to give you 50 grand. Here you go. That's 50 grand that the citizens paid out, right? Because that money is not free. A taxpayer, like if you're a resident, you're paying taxes. I'm a resident, I'm paying taxes. So that's not free money. But they've figured that there's this tipping point, right? Like if it's, worth X, then they'll pay X or X minus 1 or X minus 2, but they won't pay X plus 1. So they make this offer, and it's cheaper to settle it that way.
It's the cost-effective structure. To fight it would cost more resources.
It would likely cost
more resources.
So they're essentially taking an actuary to let them know like
what's worth the risk, what's
not. So when they're doing the hiring, they don't really want to hire a badass because he can cause more problems than he solves. Because most of the time in America, regardless of what people think, if you look at all of the data, and you can find that data, it's available because we collect it. Every agency collects it, and you can go back and look at it. So when you look at those reports, you can see, which part of town has the most violence. You can look at who the people are that are committing the crimes, who the victims are. You can look at their age range. You can look at their gender. You can look at their race. You can look at all of that because that was produced because they were afraid that Black people in particular were being targeted by police. So then the feds came and said, you need to collect all of this data, and they started collecting. So you can go back and look at what's happening, where it's happening, when it's happening. I can say, hey, in East St. Louis at this time of day and this day of the week, this thing is going to happen. And the vast majority of people doing it are this, but the vast majority of victims are this. So I can go back and look at all that data. So I can make decisions with the data that I have available to me. But most police contacts, whether it's a call for a service or if it's a traffic violation or if it's, it could be anything. The vast majority, the overwhelming majority, do not end in any type of use of force. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of police officers go an entire career, 20 to 30 years, without ever discharging their firearm in the line of duty. So I'm now
that
betting.
Metric, what you just said, is like never said on the mainstream media. Until you said that just now, I didn't know that was a thing.
Yes.
How is that not?
Well, there are people that write about it. They're not PC, or they're very smart and they use pure data, but society may not accept it. Heather McDonald is one of them. She's written many books on this. A lot of data, right? In fact, anybody that's watching that wants to challenge anything that I'm saying, I would advocate for that. Please find something that is wrong with what I'm saying because it comes from a place of a lot of experience. You want to look at what are called UCRs, Uniform Crime Reports, and that will give you a lot of data. But when you look at things like police shootings, right, officer-involved shootings, OIS, when you look at OISs across America, the number's staggering. I'm going to get a zero wrong, but it's like 0.0000068 something. It's so crazy because you have millions of police contacts that end in no type of officer-involved shooting. And then when you do look at the ones that occurred, the overwhelming majority have a suspect with a gun, with a knife, with a bat, and they're justified. Very few don't have a weapon. And very few from that are unjustified. They exist, just like anywhere. You have good fighters and bad fighters. You have good people and bad people. You have good cops and bad cops. So it exists, certainly. But the lens and the focus tends to be on the bad shoots, right? But even with shoots, like if you look at without even getting into names. If I look at a shoot where a guy was committing a felony, he had fentanyl in his system, he had cocaine in his system, he had all this stuff in his system, and I look at it and say, oh, none of that had anything to do with anything. Like, those
sure
are
about
pretty
that?
important
Yeah.
factors to consider, regardless of what your end belief is. And when you look at American policing, overwhelmingly, police contacts do not end in violence. So, going back to hiring, I don't need to hire a badass because he may cost me more if he's going out there and really heavily enforcing the laws. If I have somebody that can talk, somebody that is friendly, that gets along with people, that's working.
De-escalate.
Yeah, de-escalation is huge. The issue with de-escalation, I think de-escalation has been in policing since the beginning of policing, because at a bare minimum, a cop doesn't want to spend 2-3 hours writing a report. They don't want to go to court over it. They don't want that, right? They don't want it. So de-escalation is a normal tactic for most cops. They don't want to deal with that stuff. So they will work to de-escalate it. The problem in de-escalating, let's say I'm 100% committed to de-escalating and you're not. Now, what does my effort of 100% look like when you decide?
Not shit.
There's nothing I can do
Because I'm ready to look for a fight.
because you're bringing it, and all I can do is try to influence you, right? One of the things that we talk about frequently, when I say we, I mean me, and it's in this book, is that criminals pick the time, they pick the place, and they pick the method of attack, and we, as cops, pick what? The response. So if we're just doing an analysis of those 4 variables, the key variables in a fight, location, time, and method, those are pretty important. The response is a reaction. The first 3 are action. So I'm going to pick this place to ambush you. So I'm going to ambush you outside your place of business because I think you're coming out of here with money or something of value. I'm going to do it at the time of day where the lighting's really low and nobody's around. And I'm going to use this weapon system to hit you or ambush you. Now you have no idea that that's going on. Everything's stacked against you. You walk out of nowhere, you're blindsided from the back. Now the only thing you can do is react to that. What's faster, action or reaction?
Action.
Action's faster than reaction.
You're the one setting the pace. You're the one starting it. It makes
You
sense.
understand this is going to happen. You know how it's going to happen. You've built how it's going to happen.
You've
and now you
mentally
implement
prepared
it.
for it.
And now what you, as the police officer, get to respond. So you're always behind the power curve, always. And this is something that people don't take into consideration. I don't know why. There are a lot of people that declare they're subject matter experts on these subjects, and they don't understand the most basic aspects of it. But the agency doesn't want liability, because in this day and age, people are looking for a reason to sue somebody with money. And a city that has money is a good target for them. And if they're already dealing with criminals, that is a criminal activity to fraudulently or to negligently go after somebody. There's no founded reason. They're not really hurt. There's no proof that they're hurt. And now they're going to take this lawsuit, right? So that kind of stuff kind of pushes agencies in the direction of hiring people that are softer, that are more likely to be talkers, guys that are aggressive, guys that are more dominant or assertive. There's a good chance they're going to cost the agency money because they're going after it. If I get involved in more uses of force because I'm physically going into a spot that other officers are afraid to go to, where bad people are doing bad things, but they're more likely to respond with physical violence, whether it's this way or shooting or whatever it may be, the chances that I'm going to use force to deal with them go up drastically when this guy's running away from that environment. So, they do a cost benefit analysis and they say that we really don't want this. And then when you go to the academy, right, there's another factor too, even to consider. I don't have a criminal record. I've never had a criminal record. I've always been, in my mind, with the good people. But, people that have young age crimes that as a juvenile or adolescent, they did stupid stuff, they tend to be a little bit more streetwise. They tend to be people that understand how the community works and functions. So there is value in those people, but those people kind of get pushed away.
Are you making a stance for maybe making it, this is going to sound, I want to be careful how I word this, but not making it easier to become a police officer, but maybe removing some of the restrictions for people that can become police officers?
No, I'm definitely not saying easier because I think it's too easy to become.
Already. Okay.
Way too easy. I'm saying that you need to understand the total skill sets necessary and the value of something like knowing how to operate within the community, knowing how to talk to people in the community. I don't want to get away from the hiring process yet, but just sideline, when you think about use of force, they have what's called a force continuum. Like, you do this, and then I'm present in my uniform. Officer presence is the first step, meaning that my presence in uniform is supposed to stop you from doing something bad, right? And in some cases it will. But in some cases, let's say North St. Louis County, I show up in uniform, that starts the fight, right? They're agitated because they hate cops, and now this cop's on site. So the whole thing that's supposed to stop you from escalating a situation is actually what creates the escalation in some situations, right? So officer presence is one thing. If I know how the community works, if I know how people talk to each other, like in that community in North County, people are like, sir, please refrain from. That's not how people talk. That's not normal speak. Even if you're a professional, you talk like that, you're not connecting with them in any sort of meaningful way. In fact, you're just separating yourself from them more. So there are things to be addressed there. That's another conversation. So when the agency hires them, normally the agency will send them to their police academy or a shared, like St. Louis County has a municipal police academy, which means that all of the municipalities from the St. Louis area go there. And the same thing with Jeffco, and then like mine's from a state agency. So I went to that state agency, it's statewide. So it depends on the agency, but normally it goes to a shared, or if it's a really big city like LAPD has their academy, or Chicago or whatever. They go there, they get their training from 1,000 to 1,200 hours on average. And then they go to their agency and they do training. They can do continued training. They're called probationary officers or probies. And then that lasts from 6 months to a year, depending on the agency, what their needs are, what their ops tempo is, where they're at with their staffing. And then after that, they go out on their own. And their field training officer, their FTO, who's training them, could be good. They could be bad. Yeah. So it's not super consistent from that perspective. The process can be consistent, but what they're actually learning based on the people they're with, the area they're in, how much time they're doing it, that's challenging.
And that's the human element. I don't know if you'll ever form a process that will be so uniform and so perfect. Because think about it, martial arts as well. You're going to have good jiu-jitsu coaches, bad jiu-jitsu coaches. You'll have great boxing coaches, bad boxing coaches. And ultimately, it'll reflect on the individual who's learning from it. How many times have you seen guys come in the gym and like, well, my coach taught me this, and like their coach taught them wrong. And then they come in, they tried this, and now they're getting tapped by everybody, or they're not necessarily having the outcome that they want. I can only imagine it's that times the nth degree when you're talking about law enforcement, because it's also about how you're interacting. Like you were saying, can you de-escalate? How do you interact with these people? Can you prevent a situation from occurring? Or have you not been trained properly in doing all these things? So now, you're forced to be the hammer because everyone is a nail.
Yeah. So when you talk about that, I think the first place to address is DT, defensive tactics. So the combatives, the fighting of the police. So defensive tactics, typically, when you look at this is a broad stroke. This is not everybody, so don't cry to me. Broad stroke, you get a guy as a DT instructor at a police academy who wants to be a tough guy. And he can only teach you what he knows. And he's got a captive audience. They have to listen to him. He's the end all be all for that material, and they have to pass that course to pass the academy. So you tend to get guys that want to be tough guys who aren't actually tough guys, as a broad stroke. They can only teach the material they know and are actually competent at. They can't teach you something they don't know. So if that agency uses something like PPCT, pressure point control tactics, that's all they can teach you, right? And if that's in their curriculum at the academy, that's what they have to teach you. And if that's part of their hours for post or for graduation from that particular agency, that's what they're going to teach you. And so now you have this crap system that's proven to not work under stress against tough guys, and that's what you're being taught. And then you're being taught by somebody who has 40 hours of certification, meaning the average defensive tactics instructor course in America is 40 hours. It's 8-hour days. And most of them don't include stress. Most of them don't include fighting on, in, around vehicles, walls, don't have full gear. Yes. So, they're not super realistic. It's changing. It's changing with a few groups of guys, even some BJJ guys who happen to be cops, and in particular guys that were BJJ guys and SWAT cops because they understand much more complex environments than, let's say, patrol. Those guys are starting to modify. There's 2 or 3 groups out there that are doing that now. We do it, but because I'm involved in so many things, we only do a few courses a year on the state and federal levels. So, I'm not going to affect massive amounts.
If I may, there is always this schism between fighters and earning potential because there's only so much, there's only so many seats at the table, so to speak. I was going to ask you if there was a possibility for some of these, practitioners of various martial arts to go in and essentially be hired by the state to then have a subject matter expert on a certain martial art and train the police officers. But based on what we were talking about earlier in this conversation, it's like just because you're fantastic at boxing or you're a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, if you don't also have that real world experience where you're using this martial art in practical environments, you might be a black belt, but you might not be the person to teach these officers because you don't understand the nuance of the equipment, the scenarios, the situations. And so you might be teaching a martial art that might actually, going back to earlier in the conversation, you might be teaching something in a wrong way and may end up getting people hurt.
It's not even about a wrong way. It's about something that can lead to their demise. And so I would go so far as to say, not maybe shouldn't teach, that they shouldn't teach it. They need to understand it, hence the book. I'm talking to high-level guys that are really good jiu-jitsu guys, even good MMA guys, and the stuff they're saying is so disconnected from the realities of what they're dealing with at a law enforcement level, at the basic like academy level, or continuing law enforcement education, called CLE, or in-service training. The book is literally that. So if they read it and they take it to heart, they'll start to see, oh my God, I didn't realize this. I didn't understand this. I didn't know this.
Is there literature? I'm not familiar with the training program for police officers. I'm assuming there's various portions of this. Is any portion of that literature? And is there any literature similar to what you're providing? Like, is there literature on the proper use of certain martial arts in certain scenarios? Because when you're saying this to me, this seems like a very good tool. So I'm going to read the book because I'm interested in it. But I'm not a law enforcement officer. The actual practical use for this for me might not actually ever happen in my lifetime, but I'd like to learn about it because I'm a martial artist, right? But for someone who goes into this line of work, I would think like a product like this should be, I would go as far as to say mandatory. When you go to school, there's literature that's mandatory. You have a curriculum for certain classes. I would assume that would be the same thing for law enforcement. Am I incorrect?
There's 2 parts to that. So the first part is that there is, what we're calling literature right now in plain speak. There are lesson plans that are in place that are certified by POST, the certifying body for training in the state. So Missouri Post will approve a lesson plan. The lesson plan will have an outline of what you're doing and how you're doing it and what it correlates to and what laws it correlates to, and maybe even with an agency, they have their policy in there as well. So there is that. Normally the students don't get that. They get the physical material and they'll get a handout, which will just be an overview. Normally it's pretty succinct, it's basic, and it's a paper handout. But there's a lesson plan, and then there's a handout, and then there's the physical training. There's usually a PowerPoint presentation on the front end, and there's a lot of time in the mat room, right? The stuff that's in this book is beyond that. So it's in concepts, it's in theories, it's in law, it's in teaching people and how to teach them and what phases to go through and what to look for. And so that doesn't exist to my knowledge. I wouldn't have written it if I found something out there that had it. I wouldn't have taken the time to write it. So again, it's aimed at really guys who are teaching police that have never been police or law enforcement officers. And this gives them what they need from my perspective to then go teach the thing that they know how to do. I would take out the vast majority of the jiu-jitsu that I do in jiu-jitsu competitions when I'm teaching Leos. I don't use that style. I use something very different because I'm in a different environment. And adaptation is about changing relative to the environment, right? As the environment changes, so too do you. So, whether it's with your wife or your child, it's different. If you're in a cage punching somebody in the face because something happened and you guys agree to settle it that way, or you guys agree to fight or do a sport, that's acceptable. But if you walk out on the street and they didn't make your coffee right, you can't punch them in the face. Not legally, not morally, ethically, any of that stuff. The environment changed, right? How you do business changes. You know, do you sleep in a suit and tie? No, you don't, because the environment changes, right? Because the need changes. Because in order to get into that state of comfort where you can go into that sleep, this isn't going to make you comfortable. It's going to be very hard to sleep in, and it's not practical. So now you change your clothing. So your behavior changes, your clothing changes as your environment changes, as the laws change, as the conditions that you face change, right? You know, how many times do you see cops? You see cops all the time, but their gun is normally in the holster. Now there's a robbery going, that gun should be out of the holster. The conditions have changed. When the environment changes, your behavior changes, right? And also how we change behaviors through training. So training is what changes behavior, and it gives you the ability to change or adapt to different environments, right? Just like Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, MMA, BJJ, whatever it is that you're doing, each is a different sport. I can't go to a Muay Thai tournament and do a double leg. That's no good. Right? I can't elbow a guy in jiu-jitsu. That's no good. So you are changing with the environment, right? Same thing cops have to do. And I have to acclimate these guys that are teaching police. And I do that through education. I do that through training. So I train them to change their behavior when they're teaching cops. And then I give them even things like general templates for creating a lesson plan, how to do that, and what you need to think about, what considerations to have. It breaks it down. And the reoccurring themes is the thing the guys really need to know, as well as the kits, as well as the law. There's 2 or 3 pieces in the book that I think would change the way everybody sees things if they took the time to read it with an open mind.
Do you think, because I would think logically, I would think to myself, like, if I could, you know, go to the lab and make like the perfect law enforcement officer, I would think of someone, you know, stoic and strong mentally, athletically gifted, and then proficiently trained in martial arts. But it seems like that's not necessarily the whole piece of the pie, because you also have to have the experience of law enforcement to become better at law enforcement. Makes sense. It's almost like the same thing with everything else in life, right? So then it goes back to the initial question that I had for you when I asked you. I get the sense that this is truly like an impossible job, that to do this proficiently at the individual level is possible. Like, I'm sure you can point out at any municipality or any city a cop that is like the creme de la creme or like the gold standard. But when you're talking about something that is throughout the nation, good and bad alike, you're going to have the bad apples, or not even the bad apples, the less than average, right? If average is 50%, half of the officers are going to be less than average. Doesn't make them bad or good. It is what it is. Mm-hmm. So I asked you the question, and you kind of like in a short term said, you know, it's not. Is there, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but the reason I got you on was to educate me on law enforcement. And based on just this conversation that we're having now, it's only strengthening the thought that I have that this is truly, I don't want to say a fruitless endeavor, because you should always strive to better something. And I think law enforcement is definitely one of those things that we should always strive to be the best at that we can be. Better law enforcement means safer citizens, better communities, what have you. But it's almost like this is never going to be truly attained. So with that in mind, I mean, what is the goal for these, like, to just make it the best it can possibly be and understand that we will never get to that promised land of like...
There's an acceptable point of loss for a community. And a community will stand up and not tolerate it anymore when it gets past that threshold. So when you see whether it's civilians dying, law enforcement officers dying, like what, it's at an acceptable level, or you start to see massive change or modifications occurring. So it's at that level now where, as a broad stroke, the community, the law enforcement, senior officers, command staff, they think that it's an acceptable level as a broad stroke. I don't think they're doing a horrible job. They're working within the confines or the parameters they have to operate within.
I'm not trying to listen. I don't know anything, right? I'm not criticizing. I am simply just observing.
You're looking at it through the lens of somebody that doesn't have inside knowledge, number one. And number two, you're focusing heavily on use of force and fighting skills. It's such a small percentage of what they do that they don't put a lot of attention there, right? If you ask an average person, how often they train to fight people, the vast majority of citizens will tell you 0. And you're like, yeah, but what if somebody attacks you? What if this? What if it? You're thinking a different way than they are. And so they're crunching numbers and saying, where do things happen? Just like we talked about, you have an actuary, they look at data. Where's this happen? Oh, if we get a guy or girl that can talk good, they understand the laws, they're professional, they behave a certain way, yes. The problem is that when you hire someone who's never been punched in the face before, ever in their life, you can't have an expectation that when that happens, they won't go to the gun. They're going to go to that because they're not getting trained under enough stress.
Ben Lawler and the Tom James family will ensure that whether you're purchasing your first custom fit suit or your 50th, the process is unrivaled. With the experience and quality of the Tom James name, allow Ben Lawler to help shape the vision that is your professional brand with a suit that speaks to the conviction in their craft. With fabric sourced here in the US, you'll know quality and craftsmanship are top of class. Like a sculptor examines wet clay before creating a masterpiece, Ben Lawler will walk you through the process of selection, measuring, and stitching to ensure your finished product is a work of art. Putting your trust in Ben is a guarantee that your brand will elevate to the next level. And always remember, you don't get a second chance at a first impression.
Because they don't want lawsuits, because they are not trying to make warriors. In fact, there's a whole movement against warrior training, literally those words, warrior training, for police. There's a large percentage of the population that doesn't want police to have warrior training. They want guardian training. And there was a Army Ranger Colonel, Dave Grossman, who was teaching cops to be warriors. What the community fails to understand is, as the community, bad guys get weapons of war, when they learn tactics of war, and they behave as if they're in a war zone, the cops that are going to fight it have to acclimate to that, and it has to be commensurate. And in a fight there, it's not meant to be fair. The cop's supposed to have the upper hand. So when you look at use of force, right, there's a case law for that. The main case for that is Graham versus Connor. And that says that an officer must use objectively reasonable force based on the totality of the circumstances. And basically what it says is it's based on the immediacy of the threat, the severity of the crime, the level of resistance faced, and if the criminal was fleeing. So you look at all that data. Second to that is a case called Tennessee versus Garner. That case in particular focused on fleeing felons and whether you could shoot them. That happened down in Tennessee. And that's a really interesting case if you look at where the officer that shot the criminal in the back, if you look at that case now and see where he's at and what he talks about, that's a whole nother thing. But these case laws provide the guidelines for law enforcement officers in addition to constitutional law, Fourth Amendment stuff, search and seizure, and how I can detain you. Because if I detain you, right, that's a seizing of you. And the ultimate seizure is to shoot you and kill you because that's a seizure of life. Yeah. So these are really important things to understand. Missouri, the use of force laws like Section 563 of the RSMO of the revised statutes of the state of Missouri will outline stuff that's great for us, right? So we have Castle Doctrine here, and we have all kinds of really good protective measures for us, as well as police here.
Forgive me, what is Castle Doctrine?
So it's the extension of your person, right, to your space, your domicile. Let's say your home or inside your car, things like that, right? Okay. That's what Castle. So you have, duty to retreat would be one thing where, like, if somebody breaks into your house and they're armed, whatever, you have a duty to retreat. You don't have the right legally to fight back and shoot them. In Missouri, Castle Doctrine would allow you to protect with the appropriate level of force. If that person has a gun, a knife, a bat, something like that, and you feel like they're going to do you harm, which normally an average person, when someone breaks into their house with a weapon, they realize there's a threat and they take some type of appropriate response.
May I? That sounds absolutely insane to me. To
Sure.
What? Diagnose the appropriate force that I can have on a home invader?
Yeah. So you need to look at California, you need to look at New York, and then you have the other extreme, like Florida has stand your ground law. Like we can have mutual combat, right? Where let's fight to the death, and it's understood, and now I kill you, and that's it. There's no charges. So there's all kinds of laws. They're not the same. And when it comes to force, this is something that I write about in this book. All of the laws in each of the states are different. They are not the same. Most of them will fall within one of three categories or some blend of those three categories. So you need to understand that law. Just like firearms laws are different in every state, right? We have what's called constitutional carry here. So you, assuming that you, one, are not a felon, two, don't have domestic violence charges, three, legally purchased the firearm, can possess concealed a weapon on your person without any type of governmental approval.
Wouldn't that only extend to citizens, or is that non-citizens as well?
Yes, it should be citizens, but the law's getting gray there right now. So California is talking about hiring illegal immigrants to enforce the U.S. law. So although they broke the law to come here, they're talking about hiring them to enforce laws against U.S. citizens. So if you research that, and don't take my word, guys, research this, you can look into that and see. So all of this stuff is gray. It's not as black and white as people think it is. And so that's why when they think that a police officer or a law enforcement officer should use X amount of force, it's not realistic. I hear people saying you should shoot him in the leg. If you've got a gun and I've got a gun and I shoot you in the leg, that doesn't stop you.
You can shoot me.
If you've got a knife, you can close the distance in a very short period of time, even if I have a gun and my gun has retention. So when we talk about this action reaction, it's pretty important. The criminal starts running at him with a knife. They've got a gun, but guess what? They have to see it. They have to realize what's going on. Then when they get to the gun doesn't just come out. Most holsters now are level 3 retention holsters. So there's multiple devices on the holster that keeps them from getting it out. And if they're fumbling around because they're overloaded with stress, let's say this thing's happening, they think they're about to die, they have auditory exclusion, they have tunnel vision, they have loss of fine motor skills, and you start seeing this kind of reaction. And for people who are not used to that, for people who have not been punched in the face, stabbed, hit with a bat, whatever, in an MMA fight, the physiological response to stress is generally overwhelming. So as this guy's running at you, who maybe came out of prison, who's been fighting his whole life, who doesn't care about the consequences to his action, now this person who's never been in this environment before now is fumbling for a gun, going backwards, trying to create space. How stable are you going backwards? You can't see. Your body's not meant to move in that direction that way. And then you're fumbling for a gun with multiple layers of retention using fine motor skills. So people don't understand this. They don't understand the laws. They don't understand the responsibilities. And they are subject matter experts in the way, I'm sure you've witnessed this before, because 30 years ago when I was fighting in NHB, I saw this. How many times have you been to like a fight party or a bar where the UFC is on,
know where you're gonna
and
go
there's
with
this idiot screaming about what he should do and how he should do it?
Or if he was in that situation, what he would do.
All that does is demonstrate that they know nothing about the subject matter. And so when we talk about law enforcement use of force, whether it's BJJ guys who are now teaching cops, or it's a citizen talking about what the law should be or what they should do or how they should do it, it demonstrates their lack of knowledge in that area and their ignorance in that field. And so the first step is start to read the law, start to look at the data, start to understand what's actually happening. You know, you watching something on TV doesn't make you an expert in it. You watching on YouTube doesn't make you an expert on it.
You know, what's funny, before we started this podcast, I told you about what it is that I wanted to talk about. And you told me, you were like, we can do the 1,000-foot view over the sky, and that would take 2 or 3 hours. Only now that we're in this conversation do I really realize the gravity of that, because I can think of 6 different questions I want to ask you right now, from, you know, whether or not police officers have a lobbying firm that can make laws, or not make laws, but try to insinuate better laws for them to kind of make it easier to do their job. Is there, you know, protection practices in place for police officers? So like when something does go wrong, there's always a media presence to extrapolate on all the things that police officer should have done, right? He shouldn't have done this, or she shouldn't have done that. But there's never like an extrapolation of like the circumstances that could lead to this moment and what the average person would do in the situation. They have it actually for commercial pilots, where like if there's like an accident, they put a bunch of pilots into the same scenario and they see how many pilots can remedy the situation or also collapse under the pressure, right? And then based on those outcomings, they'll have like appropriate repercussions for the pilot in question. But it's just like, you know, if you take an average person off the street, kind of like your analogy for watching fighting. It's like, this guy who has no idea what he's talking about. He's talking about like, get up off the ground. I can't believe, like, why is he so tired? He has no idea. He doesn't know what he doesn't know.
Those are the C-red people. Those
Yes.
are the C-red people.
I
And in law enforcement, actually, to be fair, a large percentage of cops who don't train, oh, you don't understand. When I see red, I'm going to do this. That guy, there's no way that jujitsu stuff's going to work. It's ignorance. It's just pure ignorance. So they haven't done it. They don't know. It's like talking to a child. So yes, in what you say, like, for example, is part of Graham versus Connor, right? They cannot have 20/20 hindsight when they're looking at it or reviewing the case because, they know factors and facts of that particular circumstance that the officer didn't know at the time. They can only assess him based on what he knew at that time and given what another reasonable officer would do. So that's already written into it. That's already part of it. The problem is the civilian side. So you can have a use of force review board, which is great. But if it's a citizen review board who have no training or special knowledge in the area, who've never done the thing that they're judging people on, that doesn't work. Normally, you will have things like internal affairs, or you'll have another agency. Let's say something happens in St. Louis County. They go to Missouri State Highway Patrol and say, hey, this happened within our own agency, and for transparency purposes, we're not going to do the investigation. You do it. And they'll go to the professional standards division of Missouri State Highway Patrol. They'll bring those guys in. They'll review it, and they'll give their findings and recommendations. And either they'll absolve and say, no, that was justified based on these circumstances, or what they did wasn't good, but it's not illegal. So there's no criminal charges, but you need to have remedial training for that person. You need to have some type of, punitive punishment for that person. Then you need, to go and do whatever. Then you can have the other side and say, that's criminal. You need to charge them criminally. And so you get people to look at that, to review it, who have that skill set, who know the laws and who have been operating in those environments versus a random, civilian review board that doesn't understand it. Just shoot them in the leg. Like, that doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is this, and this. So you get that a lot. Why didn't he use the least amount of force? Well, he didn't need to use the least amount of force. And a tag mantra from FLETC, which is the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, is that more force on the front end typically equals less force on the back end. Meaning, if I go aggressive initially, I don't mean hurt you, but just go aggressive initially and get control of you and dominate the position, get you into cuffs, it means I need to use less force on the back end. If I play grab ass with you and then it escalates up because I couldn't take positive control of you, I may end up having to do something that's much worse. And this is where we get into, open hands versus using a taser. You get tool dependent, or using OC, or using a gun. You become totally tool dependent because you don't have open hand skills. And, a common subject, for example, is what you would call a rear naked choke, right? That's a hot topic because in law enforcement, overwhelmingly, you cannot use that. They call it a vascular neck restraint. And almost all agencies in America are barred from utilizing that technique, even though it brings their blood pressure down, right? It brings their heart rate down. You can set them down and it de-escalates the situation. Agencies say, nope, you can end up killing them because you can go from blood to air and this happens. So all of the times that you and me and all
what
these people
you just said sounds insane to me.
It is insane.
I would think that the rear naked choke would be the best way to do it because while they are passed out, I can get them in handcuffs and I don't have to restrain them after
It's
that.
a logical, but the reason that you say that is because you're utilizing logic, and more importantly, how many times have you seen guys choked out?
Oh, all the time.
And they wake up with no damage, they're fine, embarrassed, but they're fine.
In jiu-jitsu, we always say, if it's a choke, you can go to sleep. If it's a crank, tap. Like, because breaking a bone, breaking a limb, you're out for months.
And to your point, if you compete in Japan, you will notice that the Japanese frequently go unconscious because they don't want to tap and they know it's a blood choke and they just, I'm going to fight until I can't fight anymore, and that's it for honor purposes. But, if we look at damage that's done by punching and kicking elbows and knees and using other tools, I don't know what pre-existing conditions you have when I'm fighting you and you're resisting arrest. If you're resisting arrest and I need to take you into custody because you violated the law, whatever it may be, now you're fighting me, which is another violation of the law. Me trying to ratchet it up, quid pro quo, frequently goes bad. And if my level of training is low, my level of experience is low, I'm going to have to default to what's on my tool belt, which takes it up a notch or two or three, or, again, the ultimate
much
seizure.
more violent.
So the people that are saying this and doing this and pushing this agenda over the years are basing it on these outlier cases, right? Because people have been killed when these chokes are applied inappropriately.
But the exception should never make the rule.
That's not so what you're saying. I agree with that concept, and I was working a protective detail for a Supreme Court justice in a Latin country, and we were talking about a similar subject relative to U.S. law in this, and he was picking my brain, which is kind of funny. Supreme Court justice is picking my brain, but he wanted to talk about U.S. law, and he
Sounds like a smart guy.
He is, and he said to me, Todd, truth is not a matter of majority. Truth is not a matter of majority. It doesn't matter if everybody agrees this technique shouldn't be done. The truth has nothing to do with what everybody's saying. If we look at truth, right? Like, do you think McDonald's has the best food on the planet? But numbers wise, you look at them, they are the most popular restaurant on the planet by far. That doesn't mean their food is the best, right? Like, I can have over here this guy who's growing this pasture raised kind of beef and chickens, and everything is organic, and he's a meticulous chef, and he's honed his craft for 30 years. No one knows who he is. Everybody knows what McDonald's is. Truth is not a matter of majority. It doesn't matter that it's the most popular, it's the most visited. It doesn't make Starbucks coffee the best. It's shit. So the bottom line is that all these people agreeing to it and saying we need to take it out who don't understand it doesn't make it a fact. And also, to your point, we're taking these outlier cases and utilizing them. Yes, they were bad applications of the technique. How about we train them up better on it? And some agencies do. There are some, in fact, the state of Missouri, to be fair, the state agency here, they're great at training their guys up to a higher standard. They spend more time. There's more attention to detail. They look for outside education to bring it into the agency. So our state, lucky for us, just by chance, that we have guys that are really on top of it. 15 years ago, they were doing Muay Thai and wrestling and boxing and jiu-jitsu, and they were integrating it into the curriculum. And we continue to advance that program with those guys. So those guys are doing it right, but they're outliers. By and large, that kind of good material has gone away.
These legislators that pass these laws, or bodies that kind of enforce like the reduction of what I would call the reduction of tools available to a law enforcement officer, do they, for everything that they kind of take away from you, so they go to you and say, hey, Todd, you can't use the rear naked choke because it could potentially lead to a death, right? Mm-hmm. Do they then give you like the list of acceptable chokes, or the list of acceptable maneuvers?
So the word choke in and of itself,
the verbiage might be.
And I get that, but this is huge in law enforcement. You cannot choke people, because what they call a choke, even though you and I know there's more to it, what they call a choke is an airway restriction. So you can restrict blood flow to the brain, but if you go airway restriction, they call it a choke. Otherwise, it's a vascular neck restraint, bilateral. So I'm compressing the carotids and shutting off some of the blood. They don't understand it, and it's a liability, and they do a cost-benefit analysis and say, we're not going to do it. The other thing is, what you're getting into now at the state level and at the federal level as well is you're talking about politics, and you're talking about a very partisan line, because as a broad stroke, the left is pushing to get rid of it, the right is pushing to keep it. The right tends to be pro-gun, pro-police, pro-military. The left tends to be something else. So when you talk about that, there are people that will lobby in Jefferson City, where we're at, and they will push for something specific, right? So the last attorney general was pushing for this kind of stuff. Schmidt, if you know him, now he's in D.C., so he took a step up to the federal level. But you start to see it kind of shake out on party lines, and the citizen review boards tend to not be the pro and law enforcement groups of people as a broad stroke. So it doesn't always work out well. People that kind of direct where things are going, what's socially acceptable, even if it works, we still don't want to do it because it's not socially acceptable. Like, that's too aggressive, or that looks bad, right? Like, so,
how will they expect anybody to become a law enforcement officer if they're hamstringing them, this is a very violent. It can be a very violent and dangerous job. If you work in an office and I tell you you can't use the printer past 4, who actually gets hurt from that, right? But if I tell you that you're in a bad situation and if you don't navigate these waters properly, you might not be getting home. And now I'm telling you that, oh, if you do X, Y, and Z, this seems kind of insane to me.
It's insane, but let's back up a little bit. So there is a force continuum in an agency policy as to like, he does this, you can do that. He does this, you do this. So, you know, it's you're there, officer presence, and if he starts to act up, then you have verbal commands. Then you get into soft open hand techniques. Then you get into intermediary tools like OC and taser and stuff like that. Then you get into hard skills like, you know, elbows, knees, punch him, kick him, whatever, and joint attacks. Then you get into a much higher level of force and potentially justifying deadly force, right? So if somebody uses something that can alter you, so you can go look up like in the Missouri statutes, what defines deadly force, meaning not my use of it, but things that are potentially lethal to me, meaning they're hitting me in a way that can disfigure me. They're using, you know, blunt force trauma. They're using an edged weapon. They're using a firearm. They're whatever. So there are definitions for all this stuff. If a person is, when I say person, I mean police officer, law enforcement officer, if they're justified in using lethal force, they can absolutely use something like a lateral vascular neck restraint or a vascular neck restraint or rear naked choke, what you would call. They could use that. The problem is they would violate agency policy, which the consequence of violating agency policies, they can dismiss you. But at the end of the day, if I'm justified, like a policy can say you can't drive your car over somebody, but if where that camera's at right there, if somebody has an AK-47 and I'm in a patrol car and they point it at me, I'm not going to turn the car. I'm going to drive right over them. And that's legal because they're pointing that weapon at me. My assumption is that they're going to try to kill me. Maybe they're already shooting. And the solution is this big, heavy motor, this block, the engine, going through that, right? I want that heavy thing between me and the bullet. And I want to go fast and hard.
But isn't it, okay, you use the example of like, if deadly force
is justified,
then we can kind of like all gloves off. But think about it logically.
If you kill them, if deadly force is justified, legally justified, and you kill them with a flip flop, and a toe hold flip flop, actually, toe holds will kill people quicker than anything else. Just to be clear. So if you kill them with a flip flop, you're justified.
Why would that?
They're hardcore.
By the way, I don't even understand this product. So
they got these. Oh man,
educate me.
Sorry. So toe hold, like they're really big in the jiu-jitsu community. These are super high-end flip-flops. You know, jiu-jitsu, because we're going on and off the mat or in and out of a ring or a cage or whatever, you know, we're walking around in these all the time. Not, you know, we don't operate in them, but, you know, we fight in and around these guys. So this is a very common thing, as you know, a flip-flop. But these have Vibram soles. You know, you see this, right? That's coming out of the ocean off a very specific animal, right? Ethically sourced. And it's very, very specific. These are handmade in America, out of Vegas.
For those that don't or cannot feel what I'm feeling, I mean, it feels like a strong flip flop is the best way to describe it.
They last forever. I've probably got maybe 5,000 or 6,000 miles on these. Dirt, fire, mud, climbing up mountains, and you know all kinds of stuff. But toe hold aside, the mechanism that you utilize to protect yourself and to disable that threat, to put the threat down, is of no consequence. That's how they say it legally. So if I pick up a rock and I bash your head in with a rock and I'm justified in using my gun, I can use a rock, I can use a rear naked choke, I can use a whatever means. It's outside of policy. So you have constitutional law and the cases, right? The cases that govern use of force in America. Then you get the state statute. Then you get into the agency's policy. There's no consequence relative to criminal or civil penalties for violating policy. The agency can say, you violate our policy, you're done. They can fire you. So even though you can't theoretically do it based on the agency's policy, based on constitutional law, you absolutely, because it's objectively reasonable based on the totality of the circumstances. So if I didn't use this rock to do this thing, he might kill me or kill somebody else. So it's not just to protect me; it's also to protect citizens of the community.
I'm asking you this not as a devil's advocate, but more of like genuinely, I'm trying to wrap my head around the logic here. Do these politicians, do these legislators not understand that by hindering the tools to subdue an individual before it escalates? I'm going to use the term rear naked choke. I'm a civilian, right? I don't know these things. So like if I'm in an altercation with someone and I have to subdue them before they get the knife, before they get the gun, because you used earlier the reference of like if the gun or the knife, or now there's a reasonable expectation of like
and this
fear
is why,
for my life.
Yes.
It's like I'm not going to use the rear naked choke now. Now it's too late. We are now at a different level in this combat. I'm not looking to subdue you. I'm not looking to take you out because it's you or me. So we were trying to prevent this, and now we caused it.
Yes. So your question is, do they not understand it? And the answer is no, they don't understand it because they're politicians. They're not law enforcement officers, and they don't work with or around them. Number one. Number two, when you start talking about this kind of stuff, there is preemptive de-escalation. So de-escalation, I'm trying to bring it down. But if I see it ramping up and I know where this is going, and I go in and I close the distance and I control your arms and I control your waistline so you're not going for the gun, that's preemptive. That's de-escalation strategy. For me to go in there and actually use force versus talk to you from here, and I see that gun and I see you getting up and I see you agitating, I see you index it, meaning you're just referencing where it's at because you want to go back to it at some point in the near future. If I come in and I grab the gun or your wrist so you can't get to the gun, I underhook you or overhook you, and I push you away from it, I keep my gun at a distance from you, that's preemptive de-escalation. I would argue that stopped it from going to the next level, which is where the Fletzy mantra of more force on the front end equals less force on the back end, right? And this is a very difficult concept, not for people to get, but people to accept. And there's a difference, right? Even if I understand something, but politically I don't want to accept it because it's not along my party lines. America, like if you look at the pandemic, right, and you look at vaccines and masks, that used to be based on science, and it had nothing to do with whether you were a Democrat or a Republican or independent. Now all of these things have been party line, right? And you see the same thing with use of force. It's party line.
It's such a dangerous
I'm this
precedent.
or I'm that. And there's a million things, right? Because most of life is gray. It's not super defined like you're this or you're that. And if you're not in this, you must be in that. Context is lacking when it comes to use of force in law enforcement. This is why having context is so important. Every factor changes it. When you think about this stuff, if I'm fighting you, right, it's one thing. If I know you have an MMA background, great. If I know you're younger, if I know you're more fit, how about if I'm fighting you and I have an injury and I'm a law enforcement officer, I'm at a detriment. How about if there's two of you and there's one of me, I'm at a detriment. So I'm going to escalate quicker in those circumstances because those are pieces of context. If you look at lighting conditions and it's low light, right? That changes when and how you escalate, right? If I've tried to deal with you before and you fought me on 2 occasions, is it logical for me to assume you're going to fight the third time? Yes, it is. And I can articulate that and I can put that in the report. And can maybe I change where I stand and how quick I go in on something? I know this is going to happen because I have a history to look at, right? I have previous contacts with you. So those contacts create context. And those are things that people fail to see and understand, right? And the truth is right now, there are not enough hours in training to get them up to speed. And many of the people that you are training may not have the ability to reach the necessary level. And then their agency may say, nope, they're going to get through it no matter what. We don't do that. We do a pass-fail. And if they don't meet the standard, then they don't pass.
To bring it back full circle, when you were talking about the first step being the hiring process of these cities or municipalities, how much of a factor is the physical and the mental to this? Because we were talking about the training, right? So like you can essentially take anybody off the street and give them the 600 to 1,000 hours that they need to train. But do you ever factor into the, like, okay, I don't mean to sound bad when I say this, but like I don't want someone my size to be a police officer. I'm 5'7", $170, right? Like if I could mold my perfect police officer, he'd be 6'2", 220 minimum, right? And like we were talking earlier about like not creating warriors, but there's something to be said about the imposing figure. The first form of de-escalation is just having a person in uniform.
Presence, yes.
And if that officer is, and no offense to Ashley Cummins, I love her, but if that person is Ashley Cummins versus if you know who Julius Anglicus is, these are going to be two completely different outcomes. Yeah. So like when they're doing this hiring process, I'm a little ignorant to this. I don't know how much of this is like the training aspect. Do they do interviews with these individuals?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you walk through me through this process?
So one is, in America, you cannot discriminate in the hiring process based on size or color. You can't discriminate, period. And also, there's another factor to talk about here where, because you don't have experience, you don't have a way to know this. Sometimes, let's say I'm Julius and I show up in this community and I look like Julius, it's going to start the fight. And I look like you and I go to this community and they accept you much quicker. So this is where, there is some reason to mirror the community to some degree. I don't agree that if the community is X percentage this race, you need to be that. Because first of all, you have to pass a background check, you have to pass a drug test, you have to have an associate's, you have to have all these factors. So regardless, the pool is very small to begin with, and then it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So you're never going to have parity, right? Like in the NBA, you can't say, we have to have, let's say the white population 67%, NBA must be 67%. They'd fail. Yeah. Because the overwhelming majority of good basketball players are not white guys.
Meritocracy works.
Yes, meritocracy, exactly. So I don't agree that they have to be this physical specimen, because you can fight better than a normal big guy. Why? Because you train it, and because it's part of your mindset, whether you were born that way or you became wired that way through training and exposure and conditioning and experiences. So that is separate. But when people see a certain thing, it will either help or hurt, and you don't get to determine that. If you get a call for service as a cop, they don't say, hey, there's a white person, there's a black person that needs help, there's a brown person, there's a yellow. They don't say that. They just give you what they got out of the call, and you respond. So you never know what you're going to get. And so there's no way to send a specific thing to a specific
When
call.
you're saying that, you're meaning in reference to something that's happening. They're not looking for like, hey, there's two black men fighting, let's get a black cop.
Yes.
There's two women fighting, let's get a female cop. It's just like, hey, whoever's closer,
who's
get there
available.
quick.
And then that responding officer, who the first to respond to the scene, doesn't have to be the commanding one. Someone can come in and take charge of that if they're a better person for that. I worked with a chief of police now. She wasn't at the time. She was a patrolman, or maybe even a corporal. And I was an SRT, a special response team guy, like a tactical team. And me and another guy from SRT responded to a call of this subject in an abandoned house with weapons. And when we went in, he was combative, whatever. And, we took control of him. We got him out. We didn't go in at that time. We called him out. We got him out. We got him in cuffs. We dealt with him. As we're doing this female officer who's black, the subject's black, he's male, she's female. He's telling her he's going to rape her. He's going to do all this horrible stuff to her. And she's talking to him by name, and she's very calm. And then he asks for cigarettes. Yeah, I'll get you a cigarette if you promise to do this or whatever. And yeah, okay. And then he is saying crazy, like horrible threats to her as a woman. And I remember watching how she dealt with that. And it wasn't because she was black and he was black that it worked. It was because of how she talked, how she thought, how she saw the situation. She didn't amp things up. She brought him down. And he was, he had a number of mental challenges, right? He was violent, but he was mentally ill, and she psychologically took control of him. And even though he was saying really horrific stuff to her, and watching that, she was the right person. If I had another officer who was on duty at the time show up to that situation, it would have become horrible. It would have gone the other direction. And she was the right person for those circumstances. And the problem is, we don't always get the right police officer for that particular situation. If I know it's going to be an aggressive use of force, and then I send somebody who's never been in a fight, that's no good. If I know it's going to be like a hood related thing, and I send this guy that's never been in that environment, that's not good. Yeah. Or the opposite, you're going to respond to some type of, upscale environment, and the officers that you're sending doesn't understand how things are done in that environment. So they have to acclimate to. So it's never going to work out that way, because you don't have every type of officer available. And just like people, you're good at one thing, I'm good at another thing. And, we try to give them training on all the areas, but the problem is let's stop here. This is a good point to explain to you the level of training that officers get.
And then I'm going to have one question for you that I don't want to I want to say it because I don't want to forget it. we were talking about constantly training and getting these officers ready. Do you think the other part of that equation, and you don't have to answer this now, we can get on this, but the other part of that equation is also training and educating the populace? Like
Yes.
in high
Yes.
school.
Yes,
would
it's
we
your
benefit-
job to educate.
Yes,
Society,
of like if a
yes.
cop pulls you over, these are the things that you're gonna do. If
Yes.
you don't do these,
Yes.
you have rights, you have liberties, you have all these things. But understand that now this is a different environment,
Yes.
and that if miscalculations or miscommunications are had, shit can get real fast.
Hey, why don't you do this? Take your keys out, put them on the dash, keep your hands on the steering wheel, roll your windows down so they can see in the car, and they're not fighting to see through your tinted windows. Now already things you
We've
got
de-escalated.
you on your dashboard. You got your driver's license, your insurance, your keys are out. They know you're not going to try to run. Your windows down. They know you're not hiding anything.
Is it a little bit cumbersome on the individual? Can you say that it like, I guess what I'm trying to say is
That's what I do. What I'm talking about right now.
I do the same thing.
I
get pulled over.
I do myself. And let me tell you about me. In my life, 95% of my problems were created by one guy. And if you get me a mirror, I'll show you that guy. So the same thing with these guys. Like these guys are dealing with all kinds of problems all day. They see the shittiest parts of society. And you expect them to know who you are and how you operate and how you think. Like they have to go in with the idea that something could go wrong and they need to be ready. They're trying to get ahead of the power curve. You can take that away. You can hate cops, but if you want to prevent a problem, you put your stuff there, you roll the windows down, and they can see there's no threat, and there's nothing interesting. And they probably are going to know, like, you put that down, you're not hiding something. So you're changing the psyche, you're changing the direction. It's a crossroads, and you can go one way or the other. But I'll come back to this. Let's talk about training, because when you look at a 6-month academy, let's talk about what you're focused on one very small part. So I have to know how to deal with people. I have to know what the laws are. I have to know how to operate emergency vehicle. It's called EVOC. So I have to have EVOC skills. So sirens and lights and high speeds and bad weather conditions. And I have to know about roadways, and I have to understand all this stuff. I have to be able to put tourniquets on and put quick clot in. I have to deal with all these aspects. And then I have to have the people skills, and I have to have the cultural appreciation and the racial bias and this and that. And so the minimum that I need to get all of these things in is that 1,000 hours. But let's focus on one area: use of force and defensive tactics. If I say that in an academy, let's say they get 60 hours of what you would call like jujitsu. We'll just call DT jujitsu. If you're a student of jujitsu and you go 3 times a week for 2 hours, 2, 4, 6, how many weeks of training?
10 weeks. Yeah.
10 weeks. That's 2.5 months. What belt are you at 2.5 months?
It's still a white belt. You don't even got a stripe yet.
You're a no stripe white belt. If you're lucky, you're a 1-stripe white belt.
If you even know what a gi is, you might get into the no gi class because you don't even want to commit to the money of a gi in a jiu-jitsu class.
So now, let me ask you a question. Now, you've got a pro MMA fight. You don't know when the pro MMA fight is going to happen, right? You don't know where it's going to happen. And you don't know what the confines are. Is it a cage? It's a ring? Is it mat? You don't know. What in your mind is the chance of this 2 months of jiu-jitsu beating Julius?
They're fucked.
Okay, so
Forgive my French.
Why is it that society expects this no-stripe white belt to be able to handle these violent criminals who go to prison and become tough? And they were born tough because their circumstances led to them being tough. In order to survive, you had to be tough. So you develop that way, right? Then you go into environments where you're around a lot of other tough people. You got to get tougher. And then you're lifting weights all day and sleeping to recover and shadow boxing and working on, tradecraft on the bad side of things. And then you have this guy who's a really nice guy. He's got no criminal record. He's got an education. He's got a family he cares about. He's always followed the law. He's never done drugs. So now you're taking Deputy Dog and you want him to fight this career violent criminal. And now we've given him the training of a white belt. So you need to adjust your expectations for the reality of the training that person has.
Not just that, Todd. I'd go a step further. You gave him the training of a white belt and you're hamstringing him.
Yes.
So
So
creating legislation.
So
because criminals aren't going to listen to laws, right?
Forget about that.
So it's like the officer has to abide by these rules. The
Your
analogy
rules. Your rules are different than my rules.
it's not even a pro fight. You're going in, maybe doing jujitsu. You can't hit me, but I can strike you.
Yes.
We're not operating on the same platform here.
So law enforcement have more restrictions and regulations than a private citizen, and a criminal has none. So when you think about this, let's say it's me and you, and we're dealing with somebody, and we're good people. We want to do the right thing. We screw up because we're humans, and we make mistakes.
It's the human element.
Yeah, and I make mistakes all the time. So we try to do the right thing, and that's a difference. We're thinking about, like, I don't want to lose my house. I don't want to lose my car. I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose that. I want to, like, you think about consequence, action, consequence. The criminal does not think that way because they're wired for real survival. And it has nothing to do with consequence. Because if they don't get past that, let's say they're in a place where it's a 3 strikes law, right? This contact may lead to the 3rd strike, which means they're in prison forever. They have to fight with everything they have because they know what the consequence is, even though they're not thinking about it like me and you, meaning, oh, I could get in trouble. It's not the right thing. I could lose my this. If I have nothing to lose and I'm cornered, it's bad. It's very, very bad. And so you have to understand that equation going in. And I think people, and when I say people, I mean society as a broad stroke, doesn't understand that equation at all. Again, that book speaks to it. That book literally covers it. All the things we've talked about get into very specific details in that book. But it's not something that's understood by the average person because the average person has a very defined job. They don't have 50 things that they have to be good at, right? There's not an expectation from their boss that if they're a computer programmer that they know how to fly a jet. That wouldn't be expected. That's outside the scope of their employment. But the scope of an employment for a police officer is extremely wide. Vast. And remember something, they're low paid. They're blue collar workers who are service providers. This is not a white collar fancy job that you get a special education for and you get to chill and you're making $250 a year and, like,
you do this for 10 years and you can retire. And
you have agencies in North County that are $13.50 an hour.
That's insanity.
What's your expectation for that person?
I wouldn't expect anyone to personally. I don't want to say this as an insult because I deeply respect and value law enforcement. But, like, I'll use myself as an example. The amount of money that they would have to pay me to do that job would not make sense to the taxpayer. It would not make sense. It's like, you're gonna have to pay me so much money. And it's the same thing I say about, like, similar fields. Like, I don't think military personnel are paid enough for the work that they do, and firemen and honestly,
the pay is not commensurate with the risk. And in law enforcement, it's not even the physical risk, it's the psychological risk.
Yes.
And that's why you see with the military and also with law enforcement, suicide is through the roof.
And alcoholism.
Because you think about, yes, and alcoholism and drug abuse. So you see this stuff, but if you spend your day dealing with the lowest level of society, you see kids getting molested and abused. You see people destroyed. You see people can't afford to do certain things. Another thing that's prevalent in the region I'm talking about, I can't afford to go to the hospital and I call for a headache or I call for whatever. I can't afford the meds, and they know that these people have to come. And in this particular area, if the ambulance comes, the police too must respond, or the ambulance won't go in. And now we're dealing with a very costly decision on that person's part. They don't pay it. The taxpayers pay it. But I don't have access to something. So I know if I call 911 and I say I'm having this thing, then the EMTs are going to show up. The police are going to show up because they have to in that particular area. And then now they're going to take me and I'm going to get treatment and I'm not going to pay that bill, whatever, because I don't have the means or I don't want to or whatever it is. Think about how costly that is. And that is how you're trained to behave and operate. We're creating this situation. We're creating these issues that we're facing. And then we're like, I can't believe I'm facing this issue. This is shocking. It's not shocking. Like if I let you doing gi jiu-jitsu, I let you put one hand in the collar, I know what you need. You need the other hand. And then you put the other hand in, like, oh my God, he's choking me. Yes, he's choking you because you let him get the things he needed to do that next thing. And so we see it. And then what we do as a society is we have a knee-jerk reaction, and it costs us even more. So we got basically we spent all this money to do this thing that doesn't work, and we knew it wasn't going to work on the front end, the people that do it. And now we have to restructure, recalibrate, re-educate, reapply, and pay for that. So it's a complex thing, and we're not doing it justice in terms of
Going
just
to the
skimming the
nuance.
surface of this. And most people won't take the time to learn what they need to know about this stuff. That's the truth. Because most people are doing their 9 to 5, they have their family, they do their hobby, and they don't have to deal with this because overwhelmingly people are not significant criminals. I don't mean they're not speeding and they're not doing some small crime like that. That's part of society. But like in terms of violent crimes, we'll say the average person is not committing violent crimes. And so they're not going to take the time to understand this kind of stuff. And they're not Leos, so they don't need to understand it. It's just the people that have an opinion that's very strong that they're going to go out into public and spew the opinion, or they're going to be on something like a use of force review board, right? I'll give you an example here in Ferguson, in North County, when we had the riots that stemmed from Michael Brown. There were riots in August of 14, and then there were riots again in November when there was no true bill because his blood was inside the car because he was attacking Darren Wilson in the car. And he had just committed a strong arm robbery just prior to
to him.
So all of this stuff, nobody cares. Nobody cares because it's about a social movement, right? It's not about the facts because people don't care about facts anymore. They care about feelings over facts. So it's a different time, right? So
But we can't operate like that.
we are operating like that, it's just dysfunctional, right? So
But
it's happening.
think of, I try to, and I don't want to understate that, like, yes, there are some police officers that are bad at their job, and there are some police officers that do use excessive force. This podcast was not like to brown nose law enforcement. This podcast was more than anything to
have
educate
to hold
myself.
law enforcement accountable. You have to hold. Listen, I'm not here to be an advocate and speak on behalf of law enforcement. No one appointed me to do that.
Yes.
I'm talking about the realities of law enforcement. And I will tell you, when I was serving actively, I would have gone out of my way to remove bad cops. Number one, for my personal safety, because if I have a bad cop next to me and something goes wrong, it's going to be bad for me. And more importantly, the community, right? He's going to tarnish your reputation, right? And I don't care who it is. It has nothing to do with if you have a TAC team and I've got a kick in this door and this guy that's here is a bad dude and he shoots and fights and blows stuff up. I don't care what color you are. I don't care what sex you are. I don't care what age you are. I just want to know that you'll do what you've trained to do and you got my back so that we come out alive, right? And so this mindset, society is not embracing right now. They're not finding that. And so let me finish because I want to go where you're going, but I want to tell you something. When we were in that environment in Ferguson, the community came up with what they called rules of engagement. Okay. The BLM, Antifa, they created rules of engagement. So you understand, and so anybody listening understands, and back check everything I'm saying. Police don't have rules of engagement. You know who has rules of engagement? The military.
Yeah.
We are not overseas fighting a war overseas. And it's funny, the same people that say we're militarized and the same people say that we need less warrior training are the same ones using military terms. So they said, you must do these things. You guys can look it up. You can Google it and find it. There's a document with all these lists of demands that violent protesters had. The police chiefs got together and they accepted a lot of those things that were not part of law. So law enforcement, meaning people that enforce the law, were now doing things outside of it, not enforcing the law, turning a blind eye on these things because these guys got together and in the context of whatever that movement was, said, we're going to do this. And then I can't even tell you the number of people that are now legislators who were the community activists for that, who never took the time to understand all of the factors involved in that. Police do stuff wrong all the time. When you look at the factors of that case, it's very hard to understand it unless you look at all the details that surrounded it. And it's a very clear picture, which is why there was no true bill, right? There are other cases where cops are just bad people doing bad stuff. You know, ideally you would deal with that on the front end in the hiring process, or other cops would push them out when they see they got a turd in uniform.
Holding themselves each
Yes.
other accountable.
police need to hold themselves to a higher standard than the civilian community, in my opinion. My personal opinion is if they're going to enforce laws, they have to hold themselves to a higher standard. If I'm a jiu-jitsu teacher and I'm telling you you should go compete, what do I need to do? I need to lead by example, and I need to go do it myself. If I tell you to be fit and you're overweight, and that that doesn't make sense.
No one likes a hypocrite.
So police need to meet a higher standard because they want the community to trust them. You're never going to have trust if you have a guy telling you that you need to work out and be fit, and he's 400 pounds of fat. It doesn't work, right? You're like, yeah, whatever. You look at you. So they have to operate at a higher level. They need more training. I will always say more training, more training, more training. More training costs more money, and they're already paying them a low wage to do a job that's a much higher risk. Again, pay is not commensurate with risk. So that needs to happen. So in our little space, the place that we make a difference is through educating them with materials, doing realistic based training with the gear that they are going to have on, talking about things in the context that they utilize it in, and then working to educate the community, right? Giving them data. If you look at the very front end of this book, it's going to show you all the stats related to use of force. You open the very front, even though it's boring and dry, and I know that, the front load of this is here's what's happening in America based on the statistics that were mandated to prevent racial discrimination.
This one is up for ebook right now, right?
So it's
Underpinning.
paperback on tourprotection.com.
Okay.
It's ebook on Amazon, Apple, Barnes, and many other platforms. But those you can get on your Android or your iPhone, or you can hit the website up tourprotection.com and you can buy the book there.
I'll tell you what, Kayla, do me a favor. I want you to memorize this timestamp. For the first 50 people that message us on Instagram, and we'll make a clip out of this. For the first 50 people that message us on Instagram, we will purchase a copy of Underpinning and ship it to you for the first 50 copies. We will ship the book to you. I didn't think that I brought you on here to educate me. And in this short conversation, I felt like we touched on a myriad of topics in law enforcement and didn't even scratch the surface of it. I think as citizens, we also play a part in this. We are also a part of the equation. And it's okay for me to be curious. It's okay for me to want to educate myself and possibly the viewers as well. But I think if there are tools available, then we should also make use of them as much as we can. So I want to do that. Let's clip it and then we'll send it. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing. Everyone does something that betters society in some way, shape, or form. But as a man to man, now that I've sat down with you, and I feel the passion, I feel the importance of it.
That's my commitment.
It's
That's
infectious.
my commitment.
It's infectious.
That's what I want people to be able to digest. That's the front end. Then you get into the training. Then you get into the follow-ons. Then you get into the follow-ups, like changing policies, like changing how agencies do specific things relative to use of force, and then correlating it back to real-world experiences. Whether you're finding it on YouTube or somewhere else, you can go back and say, look at what happened. How do we fix that? Here's how we fix it. Right? Here are the variables in the equation that we can manipulate to get a better outcome. And that book is the best in my opinion, not because I wrote it. In fact, I don't think it's the best book that I wrote. It's very specific to law enforcement, so it doesn't apply to a lot of people. But that book is very clear on what the minimum standard of what you need to know is that will bring you above what the average cop knows and what the average defensive tactics instructor knows. And if you're in Missouri, it's even better because our statute's actually in here.
Todd, I want to thank you again for being on here. I know that you could be doing so many other things, and you have such a hectic schedule. So for you to take the time to sit here and talk with me on my small platform, I just want to say I very much appreciate it. having had this conversation, I just want to extend to you, whenever you're in town, whenever you want to do another one of these, the door is always open. I am more than willing to have these conversations.
So we talked for 2 hours about law enforcement. Now we got to get into jiu-jitsu, MMA, traveling around the world, Albania.
Dude, there's so
get
many
into
things.
all these different things.
Tell me about some of these products, because we talked about the flip flops, but
So-
and we talked about the books, but I have no idea what I'm looking at right here. These shoes.
Well, let's do this real quick. Number one, what we have been talking about is underpinning. So this book here has all of that information. I think, my opinion, if I was an average person, probably I would look at something like this. So this is Protection Formed from Humanity. This is a collection of systems and processes that any person can use to protect themselves in their house, at work, how to look at things. Like, this creates a lens for people that don't know anything about protective security. So these concepts are used not just by Secret Service or high threat protective ops or celebrity protection, but these are things that literally can get put into play right away. Like, you read the book and you can take the concepts and start to put it into play. So that's probably the most valuable relative to the average person. Now, use of force DT is underpinning. The book that's back here is called Protective Perspective. And this book is basically my response to all of the people crying about, show me pictures with rock stars and actors. And I have non-disclosure agreements, and I can't take pictures, and I can't talk about the things that I do in great detail, but I can talk in broad strokes. So this is a broad stroke picture book, because a lot of the guys that follow this kind of stuff, maybe they need pictures, right? So, so this is just that, right? This is one tour of a very famous rock band going around the world. What's it look like on a tour bus? How do we deal with specific things? How do we look at stuff again? How does our day kind of unfold? Being on private jets and, starting tours, ending tours, this kind of stuff. Like, you see the tour bus on the
Going to the
tarmac
private
with
jet.
jet. And for people that know, if you have locals following you, there's a very famous rock star right here named Nick Turnbow. That's him right there. So Nick Turnbow makes an appearance here. And then if you wanted to know, like, the artists that we work with, that's kind of in the back. So you can see that. So anybody artist-wise that discloses us publicly, we will disclose them. Doesn't work that way for government. It doesn't work that way for executives. But with artists, a lot of times they'll put our information out. So that's a picture book. The other books are kind of a blend of all of these, but those three are readily available right now in paperback and in e-format. And then Toehold we talked a little bit about, but like, Toehold is on the scene, especially in jiu-jitsu right now. I think Gordon is, doing all this stuff. I know Toehold sponsored him. Gordon Ryan, yeah. And a bunch of other guys. But AG from Toehold's been pushing these out. So they take, like, exotic skins and leathers and, stingrays, like black stingrays and manta rays. And they everything you can think of. And then they basically fabricate this in the U.S. with U.S. labor, and super, super high quality. I haven't been able to destroy them yet. I will eventually destroy them. I'm told by Toehold that can't happen, but if I don't destroy them, my dogs will probably destroy them. So it's a great product if you're into jiu-jitsu. We didn't talk about jiu-jitsu, but if you're into jiu-jitsu, you probably already know what Toehold is. And then these are Vivo Barefoots. And these guys, right? These guys are good, almost like natural shoes, right? Like toe box wise. And these are kind of like a water moccasin meets a tennis shoe. They're very comfortable, but there's not a lot of cushion, right? So it's just like wearing the flip flops or going barefoot, but you get that traction if you want to go out and run around. You can kick a bag in these. You can do CrossFit. In fact, I think these
They're
actually
very light.
are ideal for CrossFit. So Vivo Barefoot's another sponsor, and they send me these great products, and I field test them. So I beat them up and wear them out. They don't have quite the same challenge as Toehold, where they dare me to destroy their product, but they ask me, what happened, and I give them a breakdown and analysis of my experience with these guys. So these are just another one, Vivo Barefoot. So if you like to run around barefoot, but then you are worried about stepping on something, these are probably a good option. Or if you want to walk around on the mats and have mat shoes that you only wear on the mats, these are great options for that. So just a couple things. And then a couple of the shirts that I gave you This is our team shirt, right? Which is our team logo. And yes, it's very muted, so you might not be able to pick it up, but this is what it looks like. And then the book shirt. Every book that I release, we come out with the shirt, and it looks like this is Underpinning. And Underpinning is the same as the book cover, which I don't know if you can see there, but looks like this. And these are crazy soft t-shirts. You ever buy a t-shirt from me? I break even. You feel these guys.
Yeah,
These
is it
are super
Tri-Blend?
soft. Yep, Tri-Blend.
Yeah, that's the
So
best.
they're the ones. And then I just came back from South America. I was in Colombia, and I brought currency here just to
Put his
demonstrate
money where
I
his
was
mouth
at.
is.
So thank you for inviting me and talking to me about the subject. I know people are passionate about it, not just like I am, but people also have negative passion about it. And I get it. My suggestion is, 1, read the book. 2, look at the laws specifically. Then ask that agency for a policy where you live, and they'll share with you their policy on use of force. And then do something like a community academy. So they'll do police academies for citizens. So they'll call it Citizen Academy or something similar. And see what it feels like to get shot with ammunition. See what it feels like to get OC'd. See what it feels like to get tasered. So for all of those things, I've had them done to me many, many times, and you start to understand things a little bit better. And when you put them under stress or pressure, their response is very different than when they're sitting in a chair, relaxed, talking about how it should be. When they face the same circumstances, their response is not what they would like police to do. It's different. So test yourself. If you're honest, read, learn, in particular the law, your state statute, where you live, that particular agency policy, and then go to a citizen academy. See how it works and see if you keep the same ideas. I don't think you will if you're honest. If you're a diehard just politician and this is what you're going to say and do, there's nothing I can do to change you, so I'm not going to work on that. But if you want to change, meaning you want to learn and understand and grow, that's an option. And even if you don't read the book or don't learn your laws, go to a citizen academy and learn about what cops are dealing with. So that's my general takeaway. And next time let's talk about all the other stuff that we share in common.
I didn't think it would be this much.
endless.
I had an idea of what this podcast would be. Blown away. I just want to once again say thank you, Todd. You are a fascinating guy.
I appreciate your time, man. Thanks for taking care of me and getting me out here, and we'll push this podcast out.
My pleasure. My pleasure.